This is the Agoro Carbon Farming Podcast. Agoro Carbon Alliance is taking action on a global scale to reverse the effects of climate change by decarbonizing farming and restoring carbon to the world's soil. On this podcast, we're going to explore carbon farming from the soil to the atmosphere and how it affects everyone in between. To learn more, visit us at agorocarbonalliance.com. Welcome to another edition of the Carbon Farming Podcast with Agoro. My name's Scott Warr, and today we're going to talk about some of the practice changes that Agoro promotes in order to capture more carbon in the soil. And we have a multi-generation farmer that's joining us today, Frank Rademacher, who is from East Central Illinois. Frank, thanks for coming on board. Tell us a little bit about your farming operation.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, my name is Frank Rademacher. So we do farm in East Central Illinois. Personally, we farm about 600 acres or so, all corn and soybean rotation. Most everything is non-GMO, both corn and beans. And since about 2018, we have not used any tillage on those acres. And every year it gets a cover crop before the cash crop. We started that, like I said, in about 2018 when I joined the operation after I graduated from the U of I. I ended up getting a bachelor's in crop science over there. So, having that agronomy background has certainly helped in our transition to some of these practices. So then we also help a neighbor out recently, kind of started with that. So we custom farmed for them about 400 acres, and they're starting to do kind of the same transition that we went through. And then in my copious free time, I also work with Illinois Corn and Soybean Association. They've got a service called Precision Conservation Management. And with them, I'm a direct link with farmers where we go over economic data behind conservation practices. And then I also give them advice in regards to agronomy and funding. So we stay busy.
How long has your family been farming in Illinois?
I believe my grandparents started early 70s is when they first started buying ground.
Okay, so they were conventional farming for many decades. What made them shift? What made them decide, hey, we've been doing this for decades, there may be a different way? That's a very interesting shift in a paradigm.
Yeah, sometimes a painful shift as well. So they were very conventional, just like everybody in the area, up until about 2012, 2013. By that time, obviously they were getting a little older. Dad still lived in the area, and he really hadn't helped on the farm much, but they just started needing help. So he got involved with the operation a little bit. And then one of the first things that he and Grandpa had done together was go to a local soil and water conservation district meeting, and they were talking about cover crops. And that was basically at the point in time before cover crops and reduced tillage was cool. Now it's kind of the thing to do, and there's support. But then it was very new. So they started very slow on some of our worst ground, basically with the approach of, if we can make this work on the worst ground that we have, then it should work everywhere. So ran a long-term experiment on that ground. Not too many crazy input costs. They were doing it pretty cheaply, flying it on, killing it early, pretty safe stuff. And that was kind of their proof of concept.
Let's talk about that first trial. What did they decide to do on that poor ground? What were some of the changes that they made from what they had traditionally done to facilitate this experiment?
So yeah, that ground was getting worked quite a bit, a lot of tillage there because it has a hard time drying out. So then I believe it was 2013, they stopped all tillage on that piece and then started planting cover crops on it every year. And really the change, so it is nice because basically the worst ground that we have has been in this the longest. So it's been a slow change, but we have seen an incredible change on that ground.
Was that ground also a corn soybean rotation?
Yes. Yep.
So what cover crop did you go ahead and start planting in that?
We've done just about everything. So I think early on they started with cereal rye head of beans as kind of the safe option. It's pretty low cost and beans are pretty forgiving. A head of corn, that was a little bit different. They were, I think, primarily using annual ryegrass at that time, which is also a grass, obviously, but just has different properties, a little safer to plant a head of corn in regards to its potential impact on yield.
So this was 10 odd years ago. What did they see an initial improvement? What gave them encouragement to go beyond that first field?
The one thing that they knew going into it is that it's not a fast process, right?
Right.
In farming, a lot of times we're used to an immediate effect. You put on fertilizer for that year, you spray your weeds, and you see the weeds die within a week or two or immediately. This is a little different. I mean, you're talking, depending on the field and soil quality and history, I mean, years and years. And usually what we've kind of found is that the worse the soil, the longer that transition period takes. And so it's been a bumpy road, but it's getting to the point now where it dries out a little better, holds a little bit more moisture later in the season when we need it. But that's not to say that it hasn't been an absolute struggle.
Yeah. But it gave them enough encouragement to move beyond that single field. So they must have seen some inkling of a pot of gold at the end of this rainbow, right? What gave them the encouragement to expand beyond that poor ground?
Sure. The big thing, there's a lot of factors that played into that. I mean, just first was just the idea that it worked. There's no measurable yield difference that we could find at that point. So it's not like we were losing a lot of money or anything. There was a little bit of funding. So we did have some government contracts that are there to support people trying this out. So the money wasn't an issue. The big thing was they were figuring out quickly that it felt like this is where things were going to be going, right? That the more sustainable approach is going to take hold one of these days. So just to prepare for that was one reason. And then number two was just to get out of the rat race of conventional farming, where it's you've got a lot of equipment, a lot of input costs. Suddenly we had a model where we've got a planter, a sprayer, and a combine, and eventually we got a grain drill to plant cover crops. But beyond that, no tillage implements. We have a single tractor, and it's not a big one. So the full picture of what was possible out of the system is really what kept them going.
Farmers like to look over the fence and see what their neighbor's doing. Did you have any neighbors in the area that were doing this, or were you guys the lead guys in this change?
Yep, there was one other operation that I can think of right now down the road that was doing this stuff and had been for a while. They're a little bit off the beaten path, so maybe not a lot of people driving by those fields. We've got, unfortunately, a lot of fields that are like on main roads, so we definitely drew some attention there. But yeah, I mean, other than one or two operations locally, there was nothing going on at that time.
And now on that 600 acres that your family farms, and you mentioned that you're also, spreading your wings and helping some neighbors as well. Are all 600 acres on this plan?
Yes, they are. So like I said, we had those smaller areas, poorer fields that we started with originally about 2013. 2018 is when the rest of the acres, all in 1 year, got on this plan.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. There's good and bad in that. So that was the year that I graduated from school. So they took basically all those concepts that we had learned over those years and said, okay, if we're going to have another person in the operation that needs to get paid somehow, we need to do things differently. So that's what kind of drove that change. Because with that, we also started growing the non-GMO crops, right? So we had a big change in needed labor, but we also were getting premiums for things and reducing our inputs. So that's what drove that change. Now, would we do that way again? I don't know. Like I said, it is a long transition period. In terms of the biggest thing that you find is the physical properties of the soil. So realistically, the first couple of years, you're taking a step backwards where the soils are a little wetter and you're going to have to wait longer. And that can be tough. But once you get over that hump of 3-4 years, you really start quickly going in the other direction. So, the bright side is that now everything's great, right? We're in that point where we could plant first if we wanted to. On the negative side, there were 3 or 4 years there that were not a lot of fun on every single acre. So yeah, take it how you will.
Frank, in a family farming organization, and you make changes that are drastic, that conventionally you've been farming for decades, and now you're going to this new, less proven methodology of farming that there are, upsides to. Is it hard within the family to get everybody on board to say, yes, we're gonna stick with this through this 3-year transition phase?
Yeah, part of that approach for us has been because we do have several stakeholders in the farm. Obviously, Dad and I doing the day-to-day operations, so this affects what we do and how we do it. But we also have an uncle that's a landowner, and Grandpa owns the remainder of the land. And so it's just really about finding the benefits of the system and then what appeals to each person. And I run into that with my job all the time, where you need to kind of think on your feet on what are this person's goals.
Yeah.
I mean, I meet people that say, I love this system for the weed control. And then I go down to the next guy and he says, I love it for the environmental benefits. So knowing all of the possible outcomes and how to sell it to each person. But I think at the end of the day, how I've tried to frame this just on our own is that agriculture, it does change fast. And I've hopefully got a long runway ahead of me that this needs to work. So how do we anticipate the challenges that are going to be 10, 15, 20 years down the road? And a lot of that is going to be, what do the consumers want? Which I think is pretty clear at this point that it's not more chemicals.
Yeah.
So how do we reduce chemicals? How do we leave the environment in a better place? What do we do as far as things like pest resistance, weed control? Where's that going to be in 10 years? And then lastly, regulation, because I think almost everyone you talk to, it's coming in some form or another. And we want to be ready for regulation before it happens, not try to adapt as it rolls along.
Let's talk about the balance sheet, and let's maybe jump over those 3 years of transition where it may have been like the stock market, a little bit jaggedy, ups and downs. But after 3 years, when things finally start normalizing, if we can use that word, what did the balance sheet look like on the input side? Did the input side go down, or is this more labor and machine intensive?
So as far as the hard costs of what fertilizer, what chemicals, seed cost, that's gone drastically down. And in fact, I don't know how we could go much lower than what we've got now. And I can certainly get into some of those aspects, but a part of that is some of the costs we don't always think of, like you said, machinery. That's also gone down. That we've streamlined our operation quite a bit. That has been great on the input side, especially with lower crop prices. We've had a really competitive break even the last several years. Could have a crop disaster and still easily hit that break even.
Nice.
That's been handy, especially with, a lot of the weather events that seem to be a little more frequently occurring. It seems like every year since I've started, we've had either a drought or some kind of biblical flood event or both in the same year. So it's kind of nice to have a low input cost and then hopefully soils that can weather those events a little bit better. And in terms of the yield, I would say give us a normal year somewhere. We should be right around that county average, which we're happy with. It's nothing to brag about. Maybe a little bit of a reduction in corn yield. That's the more finicky of the two in this system. But by the time you factor in our lower input costs and on top of that being non-GMO production, we get a premium on the grain on top of it.
Nice.
So profit-wise, we are easily at or above where we were before. And actually, the example I have of that, Grandpa does own a field in a county that is far too far away for us to farm. It is pattern tiled. It's the best dang ground in the world, but it's farmed very conventionally. Very conventionally. And so I get the pleasure of doing the books for the whole operation. And so it's nice at the end of the year to say, okay, apples to apples, all of our low costs and high premiums versus their high inputs, high yield, and we always match them. So why would we work harder for the same amount of money?
Right, right, right. When it all pencils out, it's not all about the right side of the balance sheet where you're
Hmm.
looking at the revenue, but you also got to look at the input costs and see what is your return on the investment that you're putting into it.
Sure. And I think, part of that goes back to what I said, say we are equal in profit, say there is a regulation. Which one of us keeps on chugging right along without a change, and it's us. So that long-term viability is really what we're going for here.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you mentioned that you were an early adopter in this 10, 11 years ago. Are the rest of your neighbors looking and coming over and talking to you about it? What are you finding? Are more people adopting this in the area?
Yeah, actually there is. And it's probably been in the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years that's started to take off quite a bit more. There was a conventional operation down the road, about twice as big as us. And last 2 years, they've started no-tilling all their beans with cover crops ahead of their beans, and then using strip till as their only form of tillage before corn. So they've changed their entire operation in a couple of years. And then, like I said, the neighbors that we custom farm for, really interested in it.
Mm.
And so there's 2 operations. We've got another one right down the road in the other direction. So like I said, the public pressure is a big thing. There's more of a spotlight on ag. And now as we go down this path, a lot more money available for changing for these practices. So people are willing. The stigma is not there finally for the most part. And now you can even get a little bit of money to help that awkward 3-year transition.
Nice. Let's get a little more specific into this cover cropping and your fertilizer management. You say that you've reduced some of your input costs. I assume one of those is your nitrogen. And in a year like we've had this year, where nitrogen prices have gone to record highs, that must be a good feeling that you don't have to pay as much as you did, 5 years ago or 10 years ago when you started this. How does the cover cropping offset that lower nitrogen input?
Nitrogen management is probably one of the nitrogen and corn management is probably one of the most complicated topics. So I'll do my best here.
Okay.
So basically, as your soil health increases, generally you're going to get more nitrogen availability out of your soil. So there's let's call them 2 pools of nitrogen. There's the nitrogen the farmer puts on as a chemical input, as a fertilizer input. And then there's nitrogen naturally within the soil that has its own cycle and releases a little bit of nitrogen. It happens on every piece of ground everywhere, right? There's always nitrogen that's being tied up. Maybe it's in microbes or maybe it's in old plant material that's always cycling, being replenished. So as you go a little farther down that soil health path and your organic matter naturally starts to rise, then you get a little bit more availability. So that helps a little bit as we've gotten a little bit into this. The next thing that kind of drives that cycle is physical properties of the soil, that wet-dry cycle, the ability to keep the soil cool, hold in some moisture. That all helps that cycle. So one way to reduce nitrogen is just improve the health of your soil. And so we've knocked back a little bit of nitrogen because of that. The next thing that we're experimenting with, grain of salt, I mean, it's very complicated, is using legume cover crops. So basically a legume cover crop makes its own nitrogen.
Yep.
So when we build up a big biomass of a cover crop before our cash crop, ideally that slowly breaks down and makes nitrogen available then to the next crop. But that's still a work in progress. So
the thing that is just fascinating to me about this whole process is by building the soil into a healthier living organism with the biome in there, there's so many benefits. You mentioned that a healthier soil can weather the weather better, right?
Yep.
These extreme weather, whether it's heat or drought or biblical floods, a healthier soil is able to adapt and work better for you during that. It's also able to sequester more carbon, of course, but also the ability for it to break down and utilize the nitrogen that's naturally in the soil. Have you also seen any kind of a benefit with pests or weeds with healthier soil?
Yeah, that's been a really interesting. So that's actually what I did go to school for was like I said, crop science, but the majority of my classes that I took were pest management.
Okay.
So the term is integrated pest management. Basically, instead of using just chemical as your go-to approach, how can we build a system that responds to pests? So just backing it up a little bit, just pests in general, their role is as a signal that something is wrong in nature. So anytime that you have a pest build up, that pest is there trying to tell you something. So we've had to really take a step back and instead of just going out and spray, ask yourself, what pests do we have? What do we expect we'll have next year? If we make this change, what happens to our pest population? So in terms of insects, gosh, I don't think we have really any bug problems. The big thing there is,
wow.
Yeah. I mean, they're just because, so non-GMO corn, a little primer on that is in addition to being able to spray Roundup on GMO corn, the big thing about GMO corn is its roots and above ground tissues produce a chemical that kills pests, certain pests. So we've gone to all non-GMO. So in theory, we're much more susceptible to pests in corn, but that has not proven to be an issue. How we kind of reached that point, strangely enough, we stopped using insecticides. So strangely enough, an inverse relationship between insecticide use and pests. So the thing that adapts the best to an environment with a lot of insecticides is pests. So what instead we've built up are a lot of spiders and ground beetles that act as natural defenses. So
nice.
So that's one thing that we've seen is insects have been great. The next is actually weed control. And there's been some fits and starts along that road too. So we're using high biomass cover crops. So we are, when everybody else is out planting, not 100% of the time, but we are making the decision that we're going to wait and let those cover crops grow before we terminate them and plant into them. Because we're looking for the biomass, right? We want a lot of plant material. So sometimes we're planting into cereal rye. Basically, think of wheat. I mean, we've planted into it when it's 6 feet tall.
Wow!
And so we've got an attachment on the planter that came from Dawn Equipment Company, an Illinois company that makes some pretty cool stuff for this kind of stuff that we do. It's an attachment on the planter that actually rolls that cover crop down and makes it effectively into a mulch. So in the case of like the non-GMO soybeans, what makes soybeans non-GMO or GMO is if you can spray certain herbicides on them. So because we're growing non-GMO soybeans, we have a pretty drastically reduced chemical toolbox we can use. So, and that's a big struggle for people growing non-GMO soybeans. Is that's one deterrent is they can't control the weeds. So what we're able to do is use that cover crop mulch to even be on the low side of chemical in terms of GMO or non-GMO growers. I mean, we've actually knocked out a spray pass there. So yeah, there's challenges, but we adapt and overcome when we can.
Excellent. You're a fairly young guy, Frank. What excites you about this regenerative or sustainable type of agriculture? Why do you want to continue with this?
One is the business aspect, like I mentioned, where I like to be prepared for the future there, whatever that may be, whether it be pests or regulation. But honestly, I really just like biology. I'm kind of a dork. And so, I don't know. I don't want to say I don't know how people do it, but if we were just growing corn and then when the next year we just grow soybeans, that just seems boring. Because I mean, we've over the last, since we've been doing this, I would say we've probably grown close to 30 species of plants, just all in all. And you just get to see an amazing amount of things, whether it be the insect life that you get to see or just the plant life, the changes in the soil. I'm all for the biology.
What if you were to look in your crystal ball down the road 15, 20, 30 years, what do you think that this is going to look like? Is everybody going to be farming this way or what do you think?
15, 20 years. So it's really about what domino falls first. And I would say it's regulation. Yeah. We're already kind of seeing that places. That's what's going to drive a lot of this change. I think the big thing is going to be like the Gulf hypoxia issue, Illinois. And actually, I think there's 11, 12 states that have their own. Here's how we're going to address the issues in the Gulf, right? There's too much fertilizer coming off of our fields. How are we going to fix this? Well, I think they've got a date for like 2025 to address all those issues and cut by 50%. And And we are nowhere close to that. So at some point, that can is going to stop getting kicked down the road, and people are going to have to adapt, maybe quickly. So regulation, and more people are going to dip their toe into this. And as the pressure builds, the money builds, it's going to take off pretty quick, I think.
There's an old farmer saying that when is the best time to plant a tree? It was yesterday. When's the second time to plant a tree? It's today. So I think the sooner you can get on board with some of these practices, experiment with it, see how it works within your climate, within your geography, within your cropping system, and then have fun with it. It sounds, as I've been talking to you, Frank, you have a smile on your face. It sounds like it's a lot of fun for you. And realizing there are probably some tears and some swear words that have been said along the years, right?
Yep.
But overall, it seems like you're having fun, and that's a good thing. We really appreciate you coming on board and on the podcast and talking to us about your journey and your family's journey. Tell us a little bit more about this side job you have, and how can someone reach out and get a hold of you?
Sure. So the company I work for is Precision Conservation Management. And basically, I do what we're doing now, right? Somebody comes to me with, I want to try this. And then we kind of talk about the possibilities. My end goal there is that we can stop some of those beginner mistakes from happening. I think that just goes a long way. So if I can catch somebody making a mistake that we almost made or did make, that's pretty impactful for an operation. So yeah, that's my job, is helping people through this kind of stuff.
You're so generous, and I think that the farming community is very generous when they've gone through an experience like you've gone through this whole transition. They want to share that with their neighbors and their fellow farmers, and so I appreciate that you're doing that. We will, of course, link that in the show notes and your contact information as well. Anything else we should know about your journey that you haven't already talked to us about?
Just to say that if you do want to try this kind of stuff, hopefully there's somebody in the area. That's the best advice you're going to get, is that guy that maybe everybody thought was a little crazy for a while, but he's been doing it successfully. Those are the places to start, is grassroots in your community, and really get their take on what you want to do.
Oh, we appreciate that. If you want to learn more about Agoro, you can go to agorocarbonalliance.com. We have a knowledge hub there that is just full of information that is, some of it's produced by Agoro, some of it's not. It's just good information there. What we want you to do is do like Frank, get as much information about the subject and talk to people that have done it, and then you can make a very informed decision. So please reach out to agorocarbonalliance.com, and one of our agronomists can maybe answer some questions. So thank you, Frank. We appreciate you coming on.
Yep, thank you.
You've been listening to the Agoro Carbon Farming Podcast, where we bring you knowledge on how to sustainably and profitably transform farming through carbon cropping. To learn more about how you can become a partner, visit us at agorocarbonalliance.com or follow us on our many social media channels: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn.